On April 27, 2024, a 55-year-old man living near the serene outskirts of Pinewood, South Carolina, decided to spend his day fishing along the tranquil banks of the Waverly River. This river, winding through the dense woods of Waverly State Park, was one of his favorite retreats. Unlike the bustling parks closer to the city, the Waverly Woods offered him peace, a place where the noise of the world could be replaced by the sounds of flowing water and rustling leaves. It was a sanctuary, a spot where he could temporarily escape the complexities of life. That day was no different. The man arrived early in the morning, carrying his fishing gear and a modest cooler packed with snacks. He chose a secluded stretch of the riverbank, surrounded by thick vegetation and shaded by towering oaks. After setting up his equipment, he cast his line into the river and settled into the quiet rhythm of waiting. For the first hour, the only sounds were the occasional chirping of birds and the soft splash of water as fish leapt out of the river. But then, out of nowhere, a faint sound broke the silence, a sound that seemed out of place in this tranquil setting. It was the muffled sound of a woman crying. The cries were soft and restrained, almost as if she were trying to keep them contained. They came from somewhere across the river, but the dense foliage on the opposite bank obscured his view, making it impossible to locate the source. Initially, he hesitated. He assumed it might simply be someone dealing with a personal moment of grief, someone who had sought out this secluded area for solitude, just as he had. After a few minutes, the crying stopped. The man felt a small wave of relief. Perhaps, he thought, it was nothing to worry about. He returned his focus to his fishing, allowing the soft ripples of the water to calm his nerves. But his sense of calm was shattered moments later when a loud, sharp noise pierced the air. A gunshot. The unmistakable sound jolted him upright, his fishing rod forgotten. His heart raced as he scanned the opposite bank, though the thick vegetation revealed nothing. Compelled to investigate, the man quickly packed up his belongings. He cautiously made his way along the riverbank, navigating through the dense underbrush and uneven terrain. The sound had come from about 200 yards upstream, and as he approached the area, he noticed a small clearing on the opposite bank. There, he spotted something unusual, what appeared to be a backpack lying abandoned on the ground, accompanied by a pair of sunglasses and what looked like a cell phone. The items seemed deliberately placed, as if someone had carefully set them down before leaving. Though the area appeared deserted, the man's unease grew. He called out, but there was no response. After a few moments of hesitation, he decided to cross the narrow part of the river to get a closer look. Once on the opposite bank, he examined the belongings. The backpack contained several items: a wallet with identification, some cash, credit cards, a small Bible, and a few personal effects. None of it, however, provided any immediate clues about what had happened or explained the gunshot he had heard. Realizing the gravity of the situation, the man immediately contacted emergency services. It took responders nearly an hour to arrive, during which the man remained near the scene, keeping a watchful eye on the area. When law enforcement finally arrived, they conducted a preliminary survey of the surroundings. The officers noted the peculiar placement of the items and began organizing a broader search of the park. The man, shaken but cooperative, recounted what he had heard and seen. As the search began, he was escorted back to the park entrance, leaving behind the quiet retreat that had now transformed into the epicenter of a potential tragedy. Later that same day, another visitor to Waverly State Park stumbled upon something far more alarming. About half a mile away from the initial site, a park ranger discovered the lifeless body of a young woman along the riverbank. She was lying on her side, partially concealed by the tall grass. Nearby, a small handgun was found, partially submerged in the shallow water. The scene appeared grim, yet strangely devoid of chaos. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints leading away from the area, nothing to suggest that anyone else had been present. The discovery sent shockwaves through the local community. Waverly State Park, once a haven for nature enthusiasts, was now the focus of a mysterious and tragic event. Law enforcement quickly identified the woman as 23-year-old Rachel Carter, a well-known figure within the small-town community. Rachel was the wife of Daniel Carter, a prominent pastor at the local church whose sermons were known for their emphasis on family values and community unity. Her death, initially ruled as a suicide, quickly became the subject of intense scrutiny, as many in the community struggled to reconcile the circumstances of her passing with the vibrant, driven young woman they had known. Rachel Carter had been an active member of the community, deeply involved in both church activities and local charity work. Her marriage to Pastor Daniel had been celebrated as a union of two compassionate and dedicated individuals, their shared faith serving as the foundation of their relationship. But as investigators began to dig deeper into Rachel's life, a different narrative began to emerge, one of hidden pain, manipulation, and a marriage far more complicated than anyone had realized. According to those close to her, Rachel had confided in a select few about the struggles she faced within her marriage. While her public life painted a picture of harmony and devotion, her private life was marked by tension and control. Pastor Daniel, once seen as a figure of moral authority, was now being scrutinized for his treatment of Rachel. Friends and family members revealed that Rachel had expressed feelings of isolation and hinted at being under constant surveillance by her husband. She had even mentioned to her younger sister, Emily, that if anything ever happened to her, Daniel would be the one to blame. Adding to the complexity of the case were entries from Rachel's personal journal, which investigators found in her apartment after her death. The journal detailed a pattern of emotional manipulation and psychological abuse. Rachel wrote about how Daniel often used her past mistakes as leverage, threatening to expose private details if she ever attempted to leave him. She described feeling trapped, her independence gradually stripped away as Daniel exerted more control over every aspect of her life, from finances to her interactions with friends and family. Despite the mounting evidence of Rachel's troubled marriage, the official investigation struggled to find concrete proof linking Daniel to her death. Surveillance footage from the morning of April 27th showed Rachel purchasing the handgun herself, and no evidence suggested that anyone else had been present at the scene. The police ruled her death a suicide, citing the lack of signs pointing to foul play. However, Rachel's family remained unconvinced. They believed that the years of psychological strain she endured under Daniel's control had driven her to a breaking point, making her death less about choice and more about desperation. As news of Rachel's death spread, so did the rumors. In the tight-knit community, whispers of Daniel's alleged misconduct began to surface. Former members of the church came forward with stories of his controlling behavior, not just toward Rachel but toward other members of the congregation. Some even accused him of misusing church funds for personal gain, though no formal charges were filed. The church itself became a battleground, its congregation divided between those who supported Daniel and those who believed Rachel's death warranted deeper investigation. The tragedy of Rachel Carter's death cast a long shadow over the community, raising questions not only about the circumstances of her passing, but also about the hidden struggles so many endure behind closed doors. It was a story of faith, control, and the devastating impact of unspoken pain. A story that would leave a lasting impact on everyone it touched. The text provided is extremely lengthy and detailed, containing a full narrative that spans multiple events, characters, and developments. Since you have requested the second part variant of the rewritten story, I will continue the tale in a coherent, engaging, and improved manner while keeping it at least 10,000 characters long. The aftermath of Rachel Carter's death rippled through the community like an unstoppable wave. The small town, once defined by its close-knit relationships and shared values, now found itself divided, its collective trust shattered. Rachel's funeral was held a week after her death, drawing hundreds of mourners who packed the pews of the Solid Rock Church. The service was somber, the air thick with grief and unanswered questions. Pastor Daniel Carter stood at the pulpit, delivering an emotional eulogy for his wife. His words were eloquent, laced with scripture and reminiscences of her kindness and devotion. Yet for those who had known Rachel closely, there was a hollow quality to his speech, a carefully curated performance that masked the truth. Among those in attendance was Emily, Rachel's younger sister. She sat in the front row, her face pale and drawn. Emily had always been protective of Rachel, acting as her confidant during the most difficult moments of her life. As Daniel spoke, Emily clenched her fists, her mind replaying the last conversation she'd had with her sister. Rachel's voice had been trembling, filled with fear and desperation. "If anything happens to me, it's him," she had said, her words chillingly clear. Emily had begged Rachel to leave Daniel, to seek refuge with her and their parents, but Rachel had refused. "He'll find me," she had whispered. "He always does." Emily couldn't shake the feeling that her sister's death was no accident. The police had ruled it a suicide, citing the lack of evidence pointing to foul play. But Emily knew Rachel. She knew her sister had been planning to leave Daniel, had been quietly saving money, and gathering the strength to break free. Rachel had even reached out to a divorce attorney, a fact Emily only discovered after her death. The idea that Rachel, who had been so determined to start a new chapter, would suddenly take her own life didn't make sense. And there was Daniel, calm, composed, and eerily detached. Emily's gut told her that he wasn't grieving. He was relieved. After the funeral, Emily resolved to uncover the truth about her sister's death. She began by speaking to Rachel's closest friends, piecing together fragments of her life that had been hidden from view. One friend, a fellow church member named Grace, revealed that Rachel had confided in her about Daniel's controlling behavior. "She was terrified of him," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He had this way of making her feel like she was nothing without him. She told me he would track her every move, even install cameras in the house to monitor her." Another friend, a former neighbor, recounted overhearing arguments between Rachel and Daniel late at night. "It was always him yelling," the neighbor said. "She would just take it, like she didn't even have the energy to fight back." These accounts painted a picture of a woman trapped in an abusive marriage, her spirit slowly eroded by years of manipulation and fear. Emily also delved into Rachel's personal belongings, which the police had returned after closing the case. Among them was a small notebook, its pages filled with Rachel's handwriting. The entries were heartbreaking, detailing her struggles with Daniel's control and her dreams of escaping. One entry, dated just weeks before her death, stood out. "I feel like I'm suffocating. He watches everything I do, questions every decision I make. I can't live like this anymore. I have to get out." Armed with this evidence, Emily approached the local police, urging them to reopen the case. But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The lead investigator, Detective Harris, was sympathetic, but firm. "I understand your concerns, Miss Carter, but there's no concrete evidence to suggest foul play," he said. "The forensic evidence aligns with a self-inflicted gunshot wound, and there were no signs of struggle at the scene." Frustrated but undeterred, Emily decided to take matters into her own hands. She began researching domestic abuse and coercive control, learning about the psychological tactics abusers use to dominate their victims. The more she read, the more she recognized Daniel's behavior in the patterns described. She also reached out to advocacy groups, seeking advice on how to navigate the legal system and gather evidence. One advocate, a woman named Linda who had survived an abusive marriage herself, offered Emily both guidance and support. "You're doing the right thing," Linda said during one of their late-night phone calls. "But you need to be careful. Men like Daniel don't let go easily. If he feels threatened, he could come after you." Emily took Linda's warning to heart, becoming more cautious in her efforts. She started documenting everything: conversations, observations, even rumors circulating in the community. She also began attending support group meetings, where she connected with other women who had survived similar situations. Their stories gave her strength and reinforced her belief that Rachel's death was not what it seemed. Meanwhile, Daniel's behavior began to shift. At first, he maintained his composed facade, continuing to lead the church and interact with the community as though nothing had changed. But as whispers about Rachel's death grew louder, his demeanor became more defensive. He started avoiding questions about Rachel, deflecting attention with vague statements about God's plan and the importance of moving forward. Some members of the congregation began to distance themselves, uneasy with his apparent lack of grief. Emily's investigation took a significant turn when she discovered a hidden folder on Rachel's laptop. The folder contained emails and messages Rachel had saved, conversations she'd had with Daniel that revealed his true nature. In one email, Daniel had written, "You'll never leave me. If you even try, I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are." Another message was even more chilling. "You think you can survive without me? Go ahead and try. But don't forget, I know all your secrets." These messages were the smoking gun Emily had been searching for. She shared them with Linda, who helped her bring them to the attention of a prominent attorney specializing in domestic violence cases. The attorney, a sharp and determined woman named Claire, agreed to take on the case pro bono. "This isn't just about your sister," Claire said during their first meeting. "This is about holding men like Daniel accountable. We have to show the world that their tactics won't go unnoticed." With Claire's help, Emily filed a formal request to reopen the investigation into Rachel's death. The process was slow and exhausting, but Emily refused to give up. She attended every hearing, every meeting, determined to keep Rachel's story alive. Along the way, she faced backlash from Daniel's supporters, who accused her of tarnishing his reputation out of spite. But she also found allies in unexpected places: former church members who had their own stories of Daniel's manipulation, community activists who rallied around her cause, and even strangers who reached out to offer words of encouragement. As the case gained traction, the media began to take notice. Reporters descended on the small town, eager to uncover the truth behind Rachel's death. The increased scrutiny put pressure on local authorities, who reluctantly agreed to reopen the investigation. Detective Harris, now tasked with revisiting the case, approached it with a newfound determination. "I owe it to Rachel to get this right," he told Emily during one of their conversations. "No one deserves to be forgotten." The renewed investigation brought to light new evidence, including witness testimonies and financial records that suggested Daniel had been hiding more than just his abusive behavior. It became clear that Rachel's death was part of a much larger story, one that would ultimately expose the dark underbelly of the seemingly idyllic community. The fallout from Rachel Carter's death and the subsequent reopening of the investigation brought the small town of Pinewood into a state of turmoil. What had once been a community built on trust and faith was now fractured, with accusations, suspicions, and secrets spilling out into the open. For Emily Carter, Rachel's younger sister, the renewed inquiry into her sister's death was both a bittersweet victory and an overwhelming burden. With every new revelation, Emily found herself grappling with the weight of the truth and the lengths to which she would have to go to achieve justice. The FBI's involvement in the investigation brought a level of scrutiny that the local authorities had been unable, or perhaps unwilling, to pursue. Federal agents began to comb through every aspect of Daniel Carter's life, from his financial records to his private communications. The once revered pastor, who had stood as a symbol of moral authority in the community, now faced a storm of allegations that threatened to dismantle everything he had built. One of the most explosive revelations came from a former church accountant who had worked closely with Daniel for several years. The accountant, who spoke to investigators under the condition of anonymity, provided evidence that Daniel had been embezzling church funds for personal use. Bank statements and financial ledgers revealed a pattern of withdrawals and transfers that aligned suspiciously with lavish purchases, including vacations, expensive gifts, and even payments for private investigators. This last detail caught the FBI's attention, as it suggested that Daniel had been monitoring Rachel long before her death. When confronted with these findings, Daniel vehemently denied any wrongdoing. He claimed that the accusations were part of a smear campaign orchestrated by his late wife's family and disgruntled former church members. "I am the victim of a witch hunt," Daniel declared during a televised interview with a local news station. "My wife's death was a tragedy, and instead of allowing her to rest in peace, people are using it to destroy me and the church." Despite his denials, the evidence against Daniel continued to mount. Investigators uncovered emails and text messages that painted a chilling picture of his relationship with Rachel. In one particularly damning exchange, Daniel wrote, "You have no idea what I'm capable of. Don't test me, Rachel. You'll regret it." These messages, combined with Rachel's journal entries and the testimony of friends and family, painted a portrait of a man who had used fear and control to maintain power over his wife. As the investigation progressed, the FBI turned its attention to the events leading up to Rachel's death. Surveillance footage from the gun store where Rachel had purchased the handgun showed her interacting calmly with the clerk, as previously reported. However, forensic analysis of the weapon revealed an inconsistency that had been overlooked in the initial investigation. The gun had been wiped clean of fingerprints. This discovery raised questions about whether Rachel had truly acted alone, as the police had initially concluded. Further complicating matters were the results of a forensic examination of Rachel's car. Investigators found evidence that the vehicle had been tampered with, including the presence of a GPS tracker hidden beneath the chassis. The device, which had been purchased using a credit card linked to Daniel, provided a timeline of Rachel's movements in the weeks leading up to her death. This revelation suggested that Daniel had been monitoring Rachel's every move, further undermining his claims of innocence. Meanwhile, Emily continued her crusade for justice, working tirelessly to keep her sister's story in the public eye. She appeared on several national news programs, sharing Rachel's journal entries and recounting the abuse her sister had endured. Her efforts garnered widespread support, with advocacy groups and social media campaigns rallying around the hashtag #Justice for Rachel. The public outcry put immense pressure on the authorities to hold Daniel accountable, but it also made Emily a target. She began receiving anonymous threats, warning her to drop the case and leave the past behind. Undeterred, Emily pressed on, determined to honor her sister's memory. The turning point in the investigation came when a former church member came forward with new information. The man who had left the congregation several years earlier claimed to have witnessed an argument between Daniel and Rachel shortly before her death. According to his account, Daniel had confronted Rachel in the church parking lot, accusing her of planning to leave him and threatening to ruin her life if she followed through. The witness, who had been reluctant to come forward out of fear of retaliation, said he decided to speak up after seeing Emily's interviews. With this testimony, combined with the forensic evidence and Daniel's financial records, the FBI built a case against him. In late 2025, Daniel was arrested and charged with multiple crimes, including embezzlement, coercion, and tampering with evidence. However, the charge that drew the most attention was second-degree murder. Prosecutors argued that while Daniel may not have pulled the trigger, his actions had directly contributed to Rachel's death by creating an environment of fear and despair that left her feeling trapped and hopeless. The trial of Daniel Carter became a national spectacle, with media outlets covering every twist and turn. Emily attended every day of the proceedings, her presence a constant reminder of the sister she had lost. The prosecution presented a compelling case, using Rachel's own words from her journal to illustrate the psychological torment she had endured. They also called witnesses who testified to Daniel's controlling behavior and his efforts to isolate Rachel from her friends and family. The defense, meanwhile, sought to discredit the prosecution's narrative. They portrayed Rachel as a troubled woman who had struggled with mental health issues, arguing that her death was a tragic but entirely self-inflicted act. They also accused Emily and other family members of using the case to settle personal vendettas against Daniel. Throughout the trial, Daniel maintained his innocence, insisting that he had loved his wife and would never have harmed her. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Daniel was found guilty on multiple charges, including manslaughter and embezzlement. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. While the conviction brought some measure of closure to Rachel's family, it also left lingering questions about the broader systems that had allowed Daniel to wield so much power unchecked. In the aftermath of the trial, the community of Pinewood began the slow process of healing. Solid Rock Church, once a pillar of the town, saw its membership dwindle as former congregants sought spiritual guidance elsewhere. The church eventually closed its doors, its legacy forever tarnished by the scandal. For Emily, the end of the trial marked the beginning of a new chapter. She dedicated herself to advocacy work, using her platform to raise awareness about domestic abuse and the importance of recognizing the signs of coercive control.